So as this first part, if only there were evil people somewhere committing evil deeds, and it were only necessary to separate them from the rest of us. So what is he saying here with that part? If only.
That evil isn't specifically located within like a certain group of people, that it's everywhere.
Yeah. So if evil is everywhere, is evil in you?
Yeah.
Okay. So how do we distinguish good people from evil people? So if evil is in all of us, so if he's saying that we have good parts of our heart and evil parts of our heart. Ooh, sorry, more in the middle. So there's good in us, and then there's also evil in us, let's say. So how do we know whether a person's a good person or an evil person? How do we make that kind of a distinction?
What they do.
Okay, so evil then is something that we do, not something that we are. What do you mean?
Like, obviously you can be evil, but not like react on the like instincts that you have to do, or you could just go out and send it, you know, do some crazy stuff instead.
Okay, so then we're suggesting then that there's evil in all of us. So everybody has the capacity to do evil. But then the suggestion seems to be that evil is not something that a person is, but evil is something that a person does. So a good person is somebody then who chooses to do good. And an evil person is someone who chooses to do evil. Now I'll spare us the mathematics of trying to figure out how to determine if someone's a good person or an evil person. Because then it almost sounds like whether you do more good or whether you do more evil. It's almost like on this scale, trying to figure that out. And then of course, how much evil do you have to do? So if someone does a whole lifetime of good and then they murder somebody, does that one murder outweigh, I don't know, giving to charity or working on the weekend with the homeless or something? I don't know. Early in the semester, it's probably the first week of school, I asked this question of all my classes. Some of you maybe remember the question. If you were living in Germany in the 1930s and 1940s, I wonder how many of you could see yourself as having the capacity to have been a concentration camp guard. In other words, if you were brought in, could you have done the things that they did to the prisoners? And a lot of times our kind of gut reaction to that is, no way. I would never have done what those guards did. But I would suggest to you that if you have a gut level reaction to just say that, you probably don't know yourself very well. Because I imagine that overwhelmingly we would say, not me, but overwhelmingly we find that in real life, people do choose to become those concentration camp guards. In other words, if you take an average person and you put them in charge of, you give them that kind of command, people overwhelmingly choose to do that, especially if it's going to be between you and them. In other words, we might say, like, well, that's because they were pressured to. Fine, but that means that with pressure, we're capable of doing almost anything. And so what that suggests is that if you would do those evil things, then that means that perhaps you could be pressured into doing evil. So that means that you could therefore actually become evil. If instead you weren't born in Germany in the 1930s, but instead, you weren't living in Germany in the 1930s, but you're living, I don't know, in China in the 9th century or whatever, and you didn't have the opportunity to do evil, and you only did good, well then you don't have the opportunity to do this. And as I'm suggesting, and I wonder at that point if you really are a good person. You know, it's kind of like I've said, if you're somebody who's like, 85 pounds and, you've got hemophilia or something, I don't know, and you walk around and you just say like, violence is never the answer. We don't look at you and like applaud and say, what a good person. Because what would happen if you were 85 pounds with hemophilia and you chose violence every day?
You get murdered.
You would die, literally, because you have hemophilia. Your blood wouldn't clot. You get into fights, you get a bloody nose, and you bleed out. You're not virtuous if you're incapable of choosing evil, and then you choose good. You're virtuous if you have the capacity to choose evil, and yet you choose good. And so this is one of those things about being in a situation where you have the opportunity to steal something, but you choose not to. In other words, you have to have this kind of capacity for evil in order to be good. You can't choose good if good is just your default. In other words, you have to have the capacity to choose evil. And you have to have the opportunity to choose evil. And if every day you're faced with those choices, and every day you have that capacity in you, and yet you choose good, then that's probably the thing about being a good person. This is a war, no doubt. The things that we know we should do, and then the things that we want to do. And you will notice that a lot of times the things that we want to do kind of lean a bit more towards this evil side. You know, I mean, think about, and really if you find a wallet and there's an ID in there, you know, you could keep the money, or you could return it, who knows. I hear these stories from time to time. I don't know if you guys ever heard these things where like some homeless guy finds a bag of cash, like 40 grand or something like that. Yeah, exactly. And they turn it into the cops. It's like, hey, found this bag of money. You know, it happens way more. I mean, I don't know who walks around with 40 grand in a suitcase or a Vons bag, but apparently it happens. And then the kind of person who does that, I guess I shouldn't be surprised that they lose it, because if you walk around with 40 grand in a shopping bag, you're probably not a particularly responsible person. But then they lose it, and then someone happens upon it. I know. If you have that capacity to do evil, it's like I've asked you guys, you know, in the past, like, how many of you have saved someone's life before? And our hands very rarely go up. I'm like, what's wrong with you? People are dying every day. Why aren't you saving lives? And the reason you're not saving lives probably is because you're not in the situation where you could save a life. If you were in that situation, though, would you choose to save the life? I don't know. And none of us really knows until we are in that situation. And I wonder how many of us are, you know, we're not in a situation where we had to choose between good and evil. You know, like ugly people, they probably cheat way less than attractive people, because there's not as many opportunities for it. I don't know. You know? But if you have those opportunities and yet you choose to stay loyal, then you're a loyal person. If you're never tempted, then you're not really a good person. You're not really loyal. And I'm not saying you're a bad person. I'm just saying that if it's true what we're saying, that good is something that we choose, and if evil is something that we choose, then you have to have a choice. It's like if I go to McDonald's every day and all they have is quarter pounder with cheese, that's the only thing I can possibly get, I'm not really choosing what to eat. But if I could choose between that and McNuggets, and I choose a cheeseburger every day, that reflects something about me inside. You have to have that capacity to choose, and you have to have the opportunity as well. If it's true that evil is something that we do, and if good is something that we do. But that's a really hard thing, man. That's a really hard thing. I'm going to ask anyway. Anybody look this dude up? Oh, good. What'd you guys find out?
Gulag.
Yeah. What's a gulag?
Russian war zone.
No. What's that? Yeah, kind of like that. Yeah, it's a concentration camp. Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn wrote a book called The Gulag Archipelago. An archipelago is a chain of islands. So you think about like a chain of islands like in the ocean or whatever. Yeah, he essentially said that the gulags were like an archipelago. They're a chain of islands all over Russia and Eastern Europe. Essentially, a gulag was a concentration camp, a work camp. You'd go there to be re-educated. And Russia was famous for these. Stalin was famous for these. He was a commander in the Russian army during World War II. And he wrote a letter back home saying he disagreed with how the war was being carried out. Because he was living in communist Russia, the people read his mail before forwarding it to his family. People from the government read his mail, and they saw that he was criticizing the government. So they threw him in a gulag, and he was there for years. He wrote a book called The Gulag Archipelago, which again is this idea that the gulags were all over the place, like a chain of islands. And while there, while he's in these gulags, he wrote the Gulag Archipelago, but he wrote it in his head, which is phenomenal. The book's about 1,100 pages. It's a big, giant book. It's huge. And he wrote most of it in his head. In other words, every day, he would go about the process of writing a book in his head and memorizing it. So that when he got out of the Gulag, which he hoped he would do someday, which he was not guaranteed to do, but he hoped he would, then he wrote it down. And a lot of what we know about the horrors of the Soviet Union come from this book that he wrote. It floors me where For example, I had a professor in college who had the Soviet hammer and sickle sign in his office. He had it hanging on his wall. If you walked into an office and you saw somebody who had a swastika on the wall, we would rightfully flip out over that. We'd be like, what in the hell is wrong with this person that they have a swastika up on the wall? But if you put up a hammer and sickle, most people don't bat their eyes at it. Hitler killed like, what, 11 million people in the concentration camps? And Stalin was like, 11 million, man, hold my vodka. He killed between 30 and 50 million. The horrors of the Soviet Union, what happened in Nazi Germany was horrible. What happens in the Soviet Union, it multiplies it. He's responsible for way more death and suffering. And yet, for some reason, we don't bat an eye when we see somebody at a protest waving the Soviet flag. And I think it's just because we don't really know the horrors of what happened over there. The horrors of the concentration camps in World War II, we have videos, we have in school we spend time learning about it, we have courses about it. And yet what happened in the Soviet Union, we ignore for some reason. In fact, we have people who come along and say, well, true communism just hasn't been tried just yet. It's over 100 million people murdered by communism in the 20th century alone. And our response to that is, we just haven't done it right. I don't know how many more bodies we're willing to sacrifice before we finally get it right, and how much power we're willing to give people before we finally get it right. But that's the backdrop against which he's writing. If he hadn't written this book, we probably wouldn't know very much about the horrors of the gulags. But because he comes out, then other people start coming out as well. And this guy just had iron balls, man. This guy wrote the book, and he still went back and lived in Russia after writing the book. He eventually had to flee. But, it was pretty gutsy. That's why when you look at this guy's face, this is probably the closest of a picture I have to him smiling. This guy's face, as you can see it, he has seen some shit. And he writes about it. And he lives it every single day. So when he writes, if only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us. So imagine if the world was like that, where you had people who were just evil. Wouldn't it be great if that was true? Because then we would know who they were, and all we'd have to do is just remove them from the rest of us. And then we'd all be safe. Things would be fine. However, he says, but the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. We all have that capacity to do good and to do evil. And who's willing to destroy a piece of his own heart? That's the hard thing right there. If you could remove all of the evil from your heart, I wonder how many of us would do it. In other words, if you really sat there and asked yourself, what is it in life I'm doing that's evil? You might find that some of the evil stuff you're doing is a lot of the fun stuff that you're doing. It might be the case. It might be the stuff that we really enjoy doing. And so if you remove that evil part of you, first off, you remove half of yourself. You also might remove the stuff that you enjoy. But I would suggest to you what you're also going to remove is this capacity to be good. Because if you remove the evil, there's no more choice. This is the only thing that you do. So therefore, you're not really making a choice. You're just being what you are. Your cat isn't good or evil. It just is. Your cat doesn't sit there and have deep contemplations about whether or not they should steal your chicken that you left on the counter. And if they do, they don't think of it in terms of good and evil. Because they're not aware of it. You have to be aware of what good and evil are in order to be able to choose between the two. In other words, you have to be aware that it's evil. Now you might say, well, some people just don't think it's evil. Perhaps. Perhaps. It's debatable. It's debatable. But for the other 99.9% of us, this is an ongoing struggle, man, to figure out which of these two things you should do and which of these two things you're going to be. It's interesting that we'll do this, but we want the reputation for this. Such a hard thing to do. And also when you start to try to figure out ways to manipulate around it, I'll leave it at that, but you start doing the moral math on it, also becomes very difficult at that point. So, to kill off, I'll leave it at that. To kill off the evil half of you is to kill off half of you. Who wants to kill off half of ourselves? Questions, comments, concerns, complaints, criticisms, critiques? Weak sauce. But it'll do. Good enough. It's class motto.